Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first meeting of the Senate Executive Departments and Administration Committee. And I want to welcome you all. My name is Senator Howard Pearl. I'm the chair this year, and Senator Carson has taken the vice chair position, but thankfully she's right there to help guide me. So I want to start off this morning first. I'm going to ask Senator Carson to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Senator Carson. I'd like to just take a second and recognize our committee aide, Phil, here, and also our Senate intern, Gabriella. They'll be an integral part of our team in ED&A this year. So we have a good bill to start off our year with. It's Senate Bill 28, relative to a portrait in the likeness of Rogers Johnson at the State House. And I'd like to recognize Senator Birdsell, who is the prime sponsor. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, for hearing Senate Bill 28. For the record, my name is Regina Birdsell, State Senator for District 19, which encompasses the towns of Derry, Hampstead, and Windham. And I'm here to present Senate Bill 28, relative to a portrait in the likeness of Rogers Johnson at the State House. This bill provides that the Joint Legislative Historical Committee may accept a gift of a portrait of Rogers Johnson. And just want to give a little bit of background on Rogers Johnson. Rogers entered public service in New Hampshire in 2001, serving as New Hampshire state rep from 2001 to 2006. During that time, he became the state's first African-American House Majority Whip and was awarded the Black America's Political Action Committee Leaders of Tomorrow Award in 2004. The New Hampshire Healthcare Association Award for Long-Term Care Services in 2003, and the New Hampshire Business Council Recognition of Support for Small Businesses as well in 2003. He was then asked by former President George W. Bush to go to Washington, D.C., where he became Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the U.S. Department of Education, a position that he held until 2009. In returning to New Hampshire, he filled numerous roles, including policy advisor, speechwriter, and campaign manager for various political campaigns. He worked with many different civics, public, law enforcement, professional organizations to bring everyone together in an effort to resolve diversity issues that affected our communities. Most recently, he was chair of the Governor's Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion in New Hampshire, served on New Hampshire's Governor's COVID-19 Equity Response Team and the Commission of Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency. He also served as New England Conference of the NAACP and was president of the Seacoast NAACP, working tirelessly on efforts including passing key legislation for vulnerable populations and with law enforcement authorities to address systemic injustices towards minority-based populations. I will also say that I did reach out to Rogers when I first ran for the state Senate for him to help me on some of the healthcare issues that I was unaware of when I was as a state rep going into the state Senate, and he was incredible. So I ask you to support Senate Bill 28. And with that, I'll try and take any questions. I know that Ani Malachi is behind me, the executive director of one of the organizations that Rogers was a part of, and she will also be giving some information.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? Yep. All right. Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have Senator David Waters. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senator David Waters, Dover here. Very happy to support this bill. We've heard a lot about Rogers' career in Washington and elsewhere, and service to healthcare and various campaigns and agencies. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about his work here in New Hampshire with the Seacoast NAACP and some other organizations in which we worked very closely together on for many years. I think that his role on the NAACP, that wonderful, bipartisan organization with a long history, really added a kind of substance to its work it was able to accomplish in the Seacoast area. I would say too about Rogers is that a lot of the work that he did to promote anti-discrimination work, racial justice work, particularly for young people, was often well out of the public eye. I mean, certainly some of the cases we had in the Dover High School, some other Seacoast, Hampton Elementary School up in Rochester, and other places around the state where issues arose, sometimes made the news. But Rogers worked so tirelessly to make sure that people came to understand what changes needed to be made, and also just such a deep defender of young people and wanting their aspirations and their education to be free of racial discrimination. And I know in Dover, the Project Dream students and his work with Dover High just helped out that institution so profoundly. And that was his nature, how he could work quietly with people and bring them to a different place. And I think that we saw that, his extraordinary service. And I really, would joked about him sometimes about, his taking on the Lee Act committee. And that was a tough time, wasn't it? We all know that up here. And he stepped in, and what an extraordinary job he did. And we talked a lot about that work and the kind of way in which he created such an extraordinary consensus there that really helped move us forward. And I think promoted such deep understanding in New Hampshire for issues facing the police and how we can move forward together. And I will say too, just personally, anybody who knew Rogers understood what an extraordinary man he was. And I think that one of my great regrets was that I was going to be filming and interviewing him when we did the Concord Black History tour. He and Melanie LeVake were going to be in the front of the State House together talking about their experiences as elected African-American officials, and it just the appointment didn't quite work out. So we were going to do that filming again. We were going to catch up on it, and we just, things happen sometimes. So I think my last memories of Rogers will, in some ways, be him mending the grill at the annual Seacoast NAACP picnic. And I want to tell you, he did a mean barbecue. So just in so many ways, this is just such an appropriate honor for Rogers. But I also think him joining the Portraits on the Wall in the State House is just, to me, a very moving thing. And a very good thing for what the State House is all about. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
You want to go next? You want to go last? Okay. We'll recognize Senator Carson.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. For the record, my name is Sharon Carson. I have the pleasure of representing Senate District 14, comprising the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Auburn. And I really have the pleasure of speaking to you about someone who was a very good friend of mine, Rogers Johnson. Rogers Johnson and I both came in on the election of 2000, and he was one of the first people that I met when we have the reps get together for orientation. And he actually sat with my husband and I, and we had lunch together. And it really spawned a long friendship. I considered Rogers not only a very, very good friend of mine, but a mentor as well, because when I stepped in as a state rep and was elected, I really didn't know that much about politics. So if I had any questions, I'd be calling him. And thank God Poppy was so understanding, because sometimes I would be calling him every day. And really, that's really speaks to how passionate Rogers was about everything he got himself involved in. No matter what the organization was, he gave of himself. I've always considered him to be an extremely giving man of his time, his expertise, and his knowledge. Rogers was also extremely passionate about his family. He spoke so lovingly of his wife, and he was extremely proud of his two sons. And I can't say enough about him, and the impact that he had on me as a legislator. And it would be an honor to be able to hang his portrait here in the State House. I chair the Joint Historical Commission, and I can hopefully speak for the commission and say I would be proud, and it would be an honor to hang his portrait here with all the other notable New Hampshire people. And so that everyone who comes into the State House will see his portrait and ask questions about the accomplishments of an extraordinary man. So please, I'm asking you to please vote in favor of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you. I'll try to get this right. Ani Malachi? Malachi, all right. She's from the Governor's Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome.
Good morning. And Commissioner Quinn is here with me as well, so we'll sort of make our joint statements.
Welcome,
Good morning,
Commissioner.
everyone. So my name is Ani Malachi, and before you today, I wear 3 different hats. So, and I'll speak a little bit regarding Rogers with all 3. So I am the chair of the Governor's Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion. The other hat is the executive director of the Human Rights Commission. And the third hat is a commissioner for the Lee Act Commission, which gathered in 2020, and that was the Governor's Commission on Law Enforcement, Accountability, Community, and Transparency. So starting with the Diversity and Inclusion Council, I joined the council not too long ago, and one of the important things to note was, and I think I've heard this theme throughout, is Rogers as a mentor. And from the first time I met him, he was instantly a mentor. And if you have a father that's your best friend, although he's not my dad, certainly not old enough to be my dad, but he has that fatherly energy about him and always available for a question, a phone call, or anything that you might need. And I don't think there's anyone in the state that he didn't know. So he was, the game 6 degrees of separation between you and Kevin Bacon. It was like a 0.5 degree between Rogers and anyone or any information that you needed. And although it's exciting for me to now be the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Council, the sadness is that Rogers is no longer with us. And once he transitioned, the governor asked me if I would be the chair. And my immediate thought was, you've got to be kidding. These are humongous shoes to fill. There's no way that I can do this. But when I have a tough decision to make, or we have weighty work that we're doing on the Diversity and Inclusion Council, I do think of Rogers and how would he handle it? How would he guide the situation? What would his thoughts be? And I use that to help me to move things forward and to really listen and to be inspired and to inspire others in the same way that Rogers inspired me. As the director of the Human Rights Commission, Rogers was a commissioner from April of 2003 to January of 2008. And for a couple of years, he was the interim chair of the commission. And I did not know him back then. I was not even in the state at that point. But I can only imagine he led and participated with all of the work vigorously that the commission does, and was careful in his analysis and made sure that people felt heard and that his work was done swiftly and completely and brought fresh ideas, because that's just who he was. And the last thing before I turn things over to Commissioner Quinn, in 2020, I had an opportunity to really get to know Rogers when we served on the Lee Act Commission. And he was always available for phone calls or to discuss something if I needed additional information or I wasn't sure, because some of the recommendations that we would make would come before the various bodies of the legislature because there were statutory changes that needed to be made. And so, because of his wonderful information and keen analysis, I was able to discuss with him what that would look like and what the process was to make sure that I understood as a commissioner what I would be putting forth. And not that the LEAC Commission could control how things would eventually work out through the legislature, but it was always good to have an idea of what a recommendation that you're making, what that looks like, and how that's going to impact people, and to make sure that you're making a sound recommendation so that you give the legislature something to work with. So, all of that said, Roger's amazing man. I'm glad I got to know him. I'm sad I did not get to spend as much time with him as I would have liked. But he will always be someone that's special to me. And GACD, or the Diversity and Inclusion Council, could not think of a better way to want to honor him than to have a portrait here in the State House, which is the cornerstone of a state that he loved passionately, worked for tirelessly, and would still be doing things today were he here. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I do hope that you consider voting yes on this, and thank you again. And if you have any questions, I'll take those.
Just briefly, I think Ani has hit on all the most important notes. The only thing I'd like to say is I want to thank his wife, Poppy, for coming today. And I know that she is honored and humbled. And all you have to do, if you really want to understand what Rogers was all about, is look at his family. I know his wife and his boys meant the world to him, and she's very grateful for any consideration of this honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you both.
Thank you.
So, Mrs. Johnson, I was going to recognize you as well, and we thank you for being here today, and we thank you for sharing Rogers with us for the many years that you did. The state is a better place because of his service, so thank you. Would you like the opportunity to speak? You didn't check off you'd like to, but. Certainly, please.
For the record, I'm Poppy Johnson. Good morning, men and women of the Senate. Thank you for the guests also for being here. Rogers cared about the government. It was the most important thing to him to make sure that everyone was able to live their best life. It meant the most that he was able to serve in so many different capacities. I'm grateful that he wasn't shy. He was able to go on to committees and say what he wanted to say. He also was interested in the community, and he always made sure that he was part of the community. He encouraged myself and my 2 adult boys to also be, my adult young men, to be part of the community as well, and we were. And I know that if his portrait or the likeness of his portrait were in these beautiful hallways, there would be people who would look up at him and ask, who was he? What did he do? And when people later looked at his life and found out that he had very humble beginnings, they would realize they also have a chance to make a difference the way Roger did. And that's the truth, that we all have an opportunity to do something for someone else and basically to serve. It's just about the most important thing that you can do. He passed on more than a legacy. He made it important for all of us to give a hand, give more, and to think about other people. And I believe that he's passed that down to everyone who he's met. Thank you so much for considering this bill. We're grateful, we're honored. I think if he were here with us today, he would be very honored, he'd be thrilled. And I'm 100% sure he's here with us today because there's nowhere else he would rather be. Thank you so much. Thank you for considering us, and thank you for considering this bill.
Thank you. So I will share one quick story. I didn't know your husband well, but I did call him one time, as Senator Carson did, about a health care issue, and he was an amazing man to talk to. He shared with me any questions that I had, he answered, and I just was appreciative of his assistance. So again, thank you for sharing him with us as long as you did. We all know what it is to serve, and it puts a great burden on your family, so we appreciate you for that. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? All right, thank you so much. Well, that's all I have on my list. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on the bill before we close it? All right, seeing none. I think we're okay to accept this. Everyone's good? Oh, so I'll close the hearing. I'll accept the motion to go into exec.
So moved.
Do we have a second? Second? All right. So we have a motion. I'll accept the motion on the bill. Would you like to make one to move it?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would like to move ought to pass on Senate Bill 28.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. We have a motion to move and a second on ought to pass, and I'd recognize Senator Carson to speak to our motion.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, based on the testimony,
Michael.
Mr. Chairman, based on the testimony we had this morning, I am truly honored to ask that the committee move this bill forward with an ought to pass motion. We've had testimony about the contributions of Representative, the Honorable Rogers Johnson, this morning, and I think that if this would be a great thing to hang his portrait in the State House. So please, I'm going to ask committee members to vote ought to pass. Thank you.
Any other committee members like to speak? Seeing none, I'll take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I move that we do not put this bill on the consent calendar because I know that I would like to speak from the floor.
All right, I would agree, so that was kind of my plan. That's awesome. All right, with that, we will,
I'll make a motion to come out of executive session.
thank you. And any second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Okay, so have fun with the retirement system.
All right, we will.
After dealing with it for, I don't know how many years, I don't think I need a primer. So I'll just say hi to Marty and.
I had a feeling you wouldn't.
Yes.
Okay, good morning. We're going to get going with our next presentation. We have Marty Carlin from the New Hampshire Retirement System, and I'm sorry, Jan, what was your last name?
Goodwin.
Goodwin, Marty and Jan Goodwin. Marty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, for the record, my name is Marty Carlin. I'm the Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs at NHRS. You'll be seeing me more this spring as several bills make it through your committee. With me today is Executive Director Jan Goodwin. We're going to be co-presenting an overview of the retirement system. I think all of you are new to retirement issues. A couple of you are new to the Senate. So thank you for the opportunity for us to get this out. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, and if you want to ask them along the way or at the end, whichever the committee's preference is. I'll turn it over to Jan to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much. For the record, my name is Jan Goodwin. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Retirement System, and we thank you so much for this opportunity to present you information about what's going on at NHRS, how it works, and probably more actuarial information than you ever thought you'd be exposed to. So page 2 is the roadmap for all the different areas that we're going to be covering today. An overview of the agency, how the membership and benefits work, how the investments work, contributions, funding, legislation, summary, and then at the end we have numerous appendices in addition to the materials in the folders, so that you have different reference materials that you can look up many issues about NHRS. So if you could please turn to page 3 of the presentation. NHRS is a contributory multi-employer defined benefit plan that was established in 1967. Contributory is actuarial and Internal Revenue Code for. That means that the employees, the members, also pay contributions. It's not just the employers. NHRS provides retirement, disability, and death benefits, as well as a post-retirement medical subsidy to eligible members and beneficiaries. Once members attain eligibility or have vested, they can receive a guaranteed lifetime pension. Pension benefits are funded through employee and employer contributions, as well as the investment income on the investment portfolio that we manage. And historically, investment returns have provided the majority of the funding for the pension benefits that we pay to our retirees and their beneficiaries each month. So page 4.
So Jan, our numbering seems to be a bit different. I don't have a page 4, I don't think. Oh, all right, my apologies, I'm reading the wrong set. There we go.
Okay. So NHRS is a component unit of state government, and that's why we're here before eDNA, and we're overseen by a board of trustees. There's also, in addition to the board of trustees, there's an independent investment committee that oversees the investments, and both the board and the independent investment committee are fiduciaries. You, the New Hampshire legislature, is the plan sponsor. NHRS staff implements the statute, rules, policies, and in addition to following New Hampshire state law, we also have to follow the Internal Revenue Code. And the reason why is NHRS, the retirement plan itself, is a qualified plan under the Internal Revenue Code. Being a qualified plan means that when the members pay their contributions, they do that on a pre-tax basis. And the other magic of being a qualified plan is that the investment income on those contributions are not taxed to the members until they begin to receive their pension benefits when they retire. And we also have an important constitutional article, 36A, which governs much of what we do. It protects our funds for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits, so they can only be used to help our members. And it also requires that the board certify the employer contribution rates based on sound actuarial practice. And it also requires that those employers pay the rates that have been certified by the board every 2 years.
And many of you are probably aware of other states that have pension plans that are not well-funded. Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky come to mind. And the reason why those states are in those dire situations is because historically they have not paid their employer contributions. And fortunately, New Hampshire, for the past dozen or so years, has been very responsible and has paid the full amount. Slide 5, this is the equation that underlies and explains how pension plans work. The two sides of this equation, the contributions and the investment income, have to, over time, balance with the benefits that are paid and the expenses of the retirement system. And the key part of how pension plans work is the compounding of the investment income that we have. Albert Einstein, the famous mathematician and physicist, correctly stated that compounding is the eighth wonder of the world, and it is what makes pension plans work. As of June 30th, the total of our assets was $10.75 billion. If you look down to slide 6, you can see how our assets have grown over time. We've been on a steady increase since the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Back then, after the end of that financial crisis, our assets were a little bit less than $5 billion. And since then, through June 30th, they've grown to $10.8 billion. So we've had a nice steady increase. And these are the actual fair market values of our investments as of each of those dates. And I will, as I promised earlier, I will now turn things over to Marty.
Thank you, Jan. Page 7, it just highlighted some of the recent initiatives at NHRS. The biggest one is a pension application upgrade system, are basically the brain of the retirement system. The software that runs all the calcs and contains all the information was installed back in 2003. So that's in IT years, that's about 1,000. So we are getting the newer version of the same software, and that's been a multi-year project that we're looking to wrap up this year. Always focused on cybersecurity, both internal training and external protection. Any financial institution or government entity that keeps you up at night now. Trying to do enhanced education and outreach for members, employers, and the general public. We've always offered such things, but we're trying to adding more targeted, career-targeted education for the members and other niche training for the employers. And we'll be doing a lot of employer training with our pension upgrade system this fall because they'll have to change some of the things they do. And then we created a contact center 2 years ago, which has cut down extensively on voicemail or people being sort of bouncing between extensions and things like that. I think they answer, 80 to 90% of the questions, on the first bite of the apple over there. So people are getting serviced faster and better, we hope. Next page, page 8. Just list some of the significant developments since 2007. I won't go into a lot of these in details. We'll reference some of them in subsequent slides, but a couple of the highlights were some legislative changes, like shored up the foundation of the retirement system in late 2000s, including a change in the way we calculate the actuarial funding method of the system. There was a method in place that sort of underfunded the system sort of structurally, and that was corrected by the legislature in 2007. The Independent Investment Committee began in 2009, and the closed 30-year amortization of our unfunded liability began in 2010. Over the last 2011 brought House Bill 2, that year's budget trailer bill, which had about 25 pages of NHRS changes to NHRS benefit accruals, governance, and all sorts of things. That was by far the biggest set of changes to the plan since it was set up in the 60s. Those changes in HB2 were upheld by the Supreme Court in a series of cases, decided a few years later. And the other main things on the timeline are the boards reducing the assumed rate of investment return 3 times since 2011. And when you do that, basically you're trying to set a reasonable expectation of what you can earn over a 20 to 30 year period. And you know, the lower the rate is, that's going to drive up employer contributions, because you're expecting to lose to earn less from the markets over that time. But those were responsible steps to take. There's a chart that'll illustrate later on that back then we were above the average expectation for investments, and we crawled a little bit below it in the last few years, and everyone else is catching up with us now. This is sort of a secular trend in retirement systems to reduce their assumed rates of return. Slide 9 is just a real basic introduction to NHRS benefits. If any of you are local officials, you're probably familiar with some of these terms already, but Group 1 is our employee and teacher members, state employees and local employees, and all of the teachers. Group 2 is police and fire. Group 2 also includes state corrections personnel and positions, you know, fish and game officers, things like that. We have 461 participating employers. The state is obviously the largest. The state employees make up about 22 or 23% of the total population in the retirement system of 48,600 active members. But we also have some very small employers with 1 or 2 employees, water districts, you know, housing authorities, public libraries, and the like. So a lot of variety in the size of employers. Did you have a question?
I do, actually. Did I have that look
You
on
had
my
that look,
face?
and you had your finger on the button. That's what.
So there's Group 1 and Group 2 employees. Could you explain why there's 2 separate groups? I can see that they're categorized differently. Is it a stress level related to the job? I mean, it sort of looks like you've put emergency responders in one group and perhaps.
Before 1967, when NHRS was established, there were 4 separate retirement plans in the state. Teachers, state employees, although municipalities could opt into that plan, fire, and police. So there were 4 separate plans, 4 separate benefit structures. The structures were probably somewhat similar, employees and teachers and police and fire, you know, pre-NHRS, but they were consolidated and codified as 2 separate groups. Besides the nature of the work and the public safety side, a big distinction is Group 2, police and fire, don't contribute to Social Security, nor do their employer. So the benefit accruals and the pension formulas are a little bit larger than on the Group 1 side. That's one of the reasons. I think, you know, the nature of the work is part of the other one. So when they were they were kind of similarly situated, even as 4 separate plans. You know, the police and fire were more alike to each other, and the employees and teachers, and that carried over in the consolidation. Slide 10 just shows the breakdown of active and retired members or beneficiaries of deceased retirees receiving a benefit. Employees are a little bit more than half of the active population. Teachers make up about 36-37%, and police and fire are the remainder. Those percentages hold to some extent on the retiree side, although you'll see that the percentage of retired police and fire is a little bit greater than the active percentage, and that's because of earlier retirement ages for Group 2 benefits. So there's more, you know, retirees, you know, per capita there. And it also just shows the average member, you know, 48,000 divided by, you know, is a 46-year-old with 11 and a half years of service. And the average retiree is a little bit under 72 with an average benefit of a little bit under 22,000 a year. Those benefit amounts differ among the member groups, and we've got a slide that'll break that out a little ways down. Slide 11 shows that in fiscal 22, we paid out $914 million in pension benefits to retirees and beneficiaries. There's also something called a medical subsidy benefit, which isn't health insurance, but it's created by the legislature many years ago. It's a premium offset for retirees receiving insurance through their former employer. and we paid out $43.8 million for that. Nearly 80% of our retirees continue to live in New Hampshire. So of that, close to $1 billion and money being paid out, the vast majority of that stays in state. So, obviously employer contributions, affect local taxpayers as well as the state, but there is an economic impact to these benefits being paid. These retirees are using that money to pay their property taxes, go out to eat, hire somebody to clean their furnace, whatever. So, there is a lot tied in there. And slide 12 just shows FY22 benefits paid by county. So you get the idea of, where that's money going. Not surprisingly, the southern counties have the largest percentage, but even COAS, 22.6 million in pension benefits paid out. Slide 13, I talked about the two different member groups. There are 4 different types of retirement benefits available through NHRS, and they're all outlined in the statute. So over the course of the session, you may see some bills about some or all of these types of retirement. But service retirement is the most common type. That's you're old enough, you put your paperwork in and you retire. Most of our members go out on a service retirement. There is also a disability benefit available. There's 2 types, job-related and non-job-related, with different eligibility criteria for those. Early retirement is an option where someone with enough years plus age can take a reduced benefit before their full retirement age, and that's a permanent reduction that carries over. And then there's vested deferred retirement. These are folks who have put in at least 10 years as a contributing member of the retirement system. They keep their funds with the retirement system. They can come back to us and get a pension based on their prior service when they become eligible for it. There's about 2,700 people right now who are in vested deferred status. That could be somebody who's 35 and open their own business or something, but they work, for the state or a town for 10 or 12 years. There's different benefit provisions for Group 1 and Group 2, and I mentioned that earlier. And since 2011, with the advent of that House Bill 2 that year, there are different benefit provisions that apply based on the member's vested status at the time the law was enacted and their date of hire. So what that means is there's basically 3 tiers within Group 1 and within Group 2. We're actually, as part of the system upgrade, we're actually labeling them Tier A, B, and C. We had been, for the past decade, referring to them in the sort of long-winded members vested prior to January 1st of 2012, members in the retirement system prior to July 1st of 2011, and not vested prior to January 1st of 2012, which is Tier B, and then members hired on or after July 1st of 11. So trying to streamline the nomenclature a little bit there, finally. Just sort of around the office, we refer to the 7-1-11 hires as new hires, and they're not really that new anymore. They've been here 11 years, so it's another reason to change the terminology. Our benefits, regardless of tier or group, consist of are determined by statutory formulas that consist of 3 primary components. Creditable service, the months and years that you've worked as a member or any time you've been eligible to purchase. Average final compensation, that's going to be either the member's highest 3 or highest 5 years of compensation, and then a benefit multiplier, and there's a host of different multipliers in each tier for how that works, particularly in Group 2. There's in the appendix, which we're not going to go over those slides, there are sample benefit formulas for a Group 1 and a Group 2 member hired on or after 7/1/11 for reference if you ever needed to see that. Slide 14, that's the average benefit by group that I alluded to earlier. For Group 1, employee and teacher, and Group 2, police and fire. When you average it all out, it's $21,862. Again, the police and fire don't earn Social Security credits or pay into the system for their Group 2 service in New Hampshire, so that that's one of the reasons the benefit are generated or larger there. And also one of the reasons the teacher benefits are larger than employees is the number of years that the folks retire with. Teachers, 2/3 of them retire with 25 or more years of service, and probably, you know, a quarter of them or more retire with 30 years. You know, the public safety and education tend to be career jobs, and people tend to stay, you know, where they started, or at least in the same state. So they have more years of service when they retire. Employee positions, especially on the local level, you may work at town hall for 10 years and then do something else, and so you don't end up getting a large pension in the end. So that's how that breaks down. And slide 15 just shows a breakdown of a percentage of people receiving a benefit under 10,000 a year, under 25, under 50, and greater than 75. It's human nature to, you know, oh, give me a list of the pensions, and you look at the top of the list and say, wow, but those people earn those benefits through years of service, the salaries they earned while they worked, you know, and things like that. So they're typically senior folks who put in 30 plus years, but those are the minority. Most of our members see a benefit under 50,000 a year. For the Group 1 members, coupled with Social Security, hopefully that's enough for them to have a reasonable lifestyle in retirement. We don't, our benefit isn't designed on the Group 1 side to be the sole source of income. Let's see, slide 16, cost of living adjustments. This is, I think, a Senate bill title about that typically would start in this committee. They are not automatic in New Hampshire. So once the retiree's benefit is finalized and they're receiving that monthly benefit, there's no guarantee of any increases going forward. The legislature would need to pass a cost of living adjustment, and there are two types. You could do a permanent cost of living adjustment, which, you know, goes every year going forward, or there's also called the temporary supplemental allowance, which is a one-year payment of a flat dollar amount. That was done last year for some of our retirees. The last COLA was granted in 2019 to take effect in fiscal 21, and that was 1.5% on the first $50,000 of pension benefit for everyone. So typically, COLAs need to be funded either through one-time payments up front or through increased employer contributions. Last year's $500 payment, the state picked that up for all of their retirees. That was about $11 million. The COLA in 2019 was added to the employer contribution rates, and that gets sort of paid off over 20 years. So that's sort of the membership benefit summary. I'm going to turn it back over to Jan, but in case anybody had any questions about that beforehand,
You might have shared this, but where the monies go in slide, and just make sure I got this right, and you might have already said it, where the contributions come in, investment income goes to the trust fund, and the equation must be balanced in the long term. Where are those monies invested?
I'll be talking about that in the next couple minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Marty. So I'm going to talk more about the investments and how the board itself is composed and works. So on slide 17, we've got a board of trustees, which is made up of 13 different people. There are 3 groups of different types of board members, and all of the board members have to be approved by the governor and council process. So there are 4 individuals that are appointed by the governor. There are 4 individuals that are appointed by different member groups. And then there are 4 different employer groups that are represented on the board. The 13th member of the board is the state treasurer, Monica Mezzapelle, who serves in an ex officio capacity. And if you want to look at page 35 in the appendix, it lists the names of all the different board members. So the board has some very important responsibilities, one of which is approving the investment policy, which includes setting the asset allocation for our portfolio. If you talk to an investment professional, they will tell you that choosing the asset classes that you invest in is the most significant investment decision that you make. That's more important than the actual managers. It's how you break it down between stocks and bonds is the most important decision. The Board of Trustees is also responsible for hiring the investment consultant. And in addition to the board, we also have an independent investment committee that was created by the legislature effective January 1, 2009. Page 36 in the appendices lists all the different members of the independent investment committee. 2 of the members are from the board. 3 are appointed by the governor. Also, those 3 people also have to go through the governor and council process. And then there's a 6th member who is a non-voting member who represents the employees, the different members of the plan. So the Independent Investment Committee recommends investment policy to the board and oversees the administration of the investment program. And they hire the actual investment service providers, such as the custodian and the different investment managers. And every year they prepare a comprehensive annual report for approval by the board. And just in the last week or so, Marty has dropped off the copy of that for the legislature. So that's here, as well as being on our website. If you could turn to page 18, and this is getting more into the senator's question about how we invest the money. We break it down into 5 different broad asset classes. The investment committee regularly reviews these different asset classes, and one of the things about NHRS, which is different from other investors, is that we have a very long time horizon, because New Hampshire is going to be here for a very long time and will be employing employees for a very long time who will be needing retirement benefits. So therefore, our investment committee takes a much longer time horizon than you would for your own individual investments, even for your retirement. So the IIC has to balance risk and liquidity for all the different investments, and they manage a diverse portfolio of different types of assets. So broadly speaking, looking at the pie charts below, starting at the clock at around 12 o'clock, the largest asset class is domestic equities, so that's stocks that we have in different U.S. companies. And then there are non-U.S. equities, so shares in foreign companies. And then there's, keep going around the clock, the green area is fixed income, which is the investment word for bonds. And then continuing up is real estate. And then we also have investments in alternative investments categories such as private equity and private debt. Yes.
So do we have is it the board that's making these investment decisions, or do we have an investment counselor, or is the board the investment counselor?
It is the independent investment committee that comes up with a recommendation on how the assets should be divided into these different groups of assets. And then the independent investment committee is responsible for hiring and terminating the actual managers of the investments.
So we have a daily manager that's really watching these things?
Multiple managers,
Yes, okay.
because these are all, very specialized investments, and we want to have the best people so that we can maximize the return for our members.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Slide 19 gives you an idea of how our investment returns have varied over time. This past fiscal year that ended June 30th was very challenging for us as well as other investors. We had a negative return for that year of 6.1%. However, that did exceed our benchmark of negative 9.3%. But compared to our peers, we actually did fairly well, both in the short term and in the long term. But things have started to tick up a bit since the end of the fiscal year, and so far this fiscal year through the end of November, our return is 3.5%. And you'll see on the bottom of the slide that our assumed rate of return is 6.75%. Marty talked about this a little bit earlier, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes explaining how we come up with that target amount. our actuary comes up with a recommendation. And the way they do that is they look at all of the different types of assets we're invested in. And then they poll different investment consultants and ask them, what do you think is the expected return for domestic equities over the next 5 or 10 years? What do you think foreign equities are going to do? What do you think bonds are going to do? You just go through the whole laundry list of all of our different investment types, and then they come up with an average of the expectation for each asset and then apply that in proportion to what our entire portfolio looks like, and they come up with a recommendation, and then the board has to approve that. And as Marty says, it's very important because it affects the size of our unfunded liability, because that's the discount rate that our actuaries use to calculate the present value of our unfunded liability, which then goes in and determines what the employer contribution rates are going to be, because we are on a path to amortize that unfunded liability over 30 years. Slide 20. This chart illustrates why actuaries like using smoothed returns, and they do that over a 5-year period. And you can see by looking at the different individual annual returns since 2007 and how they've varied over time. So 2007 was an up year, and then we had the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, followed by 2 more very positive years. And if we were to be setting our employer contribution rates on the last year's actual investment performance, you could see that the employer contribution rates would be gyrating up and down every 2 years. And that would cause our employers to be very unhappy with the board and the contribution rate. So that's why our actuaries use a smoothed over 5-year period. And that is shown by the gray line on this page. And you can see that that is much less bouncy than the individual yearly returns are. The next slide is slide 21. As I mentioned earlier, our performance for the past fiscal year was better than 80% of our peers over the last 10-year period. And for the 13 years that the Independent Investment Committee has been in charge of the investments, our fund outperformed 81% of our peers. And the outperformance relative to the median of other public pension plans since the IIC has been in charge of the investments represents approximately $325 million in additional returns. So having the Independent Investment Committee was a very good decision that the legislature made. Then if you could please turn to page 22. As Marty mentioned earlier, our assumed rate of return has typically been less than that of our other public pension plans. You can see that our number has changed over time, going from a high of 9.5% in the early 2000s and down to 6.75%, whereas other public pension plans have been closer to 8% and have been dropping over time. And with that, I will turn matters over to Marty.
And now we're getting into the heavy stuff. So there'll be a quiz later. No, just kidding. Contributions and funding. This is typically even on policy legislation. It tends to come down to a lot of questions about how much is it going to cost or how much is it going to save. So hopefully I can give you sort of a brief overview of how our contribution and are determined, and you know why we are why they are what they are right now. As Jan mentioned at the beginning, members contribute into the plan. Their contributions are set by statute. So employees and teachers pay 7% of their pay every pay period into NHRS. Police pay 11.55%, and fire pays 11.8%. Those contributions were increased back in 2011 in HB2. Prior to that, they'd been the same since the late 80s. So the legislature doesn't tend to tinker with the member side that often. in terms of contributions. The employer rates, however, are actuarially determined every 2 years. So by statute, even numbered years, we have to certify the rates no later than October 1st. We did them actually earlier in July this year, because we start getting calls from towns and schools and even DIS asking what the rates are going to be, because they're starting to build their budgets for the next year or two. Local employers pay 100% of the contributions for teachers, police, and fire. They had prior to that been a state subsidy for those costs for local employers for those 3 member groups that was repealed in 2011. Last year, there was a bill, House Bill 1221. It provided a one-time reimbursement of 7.5% for local employer contributions made in fiscal 22. So that was just a one-year return of was about 26 million, I think. I think there is a title both in the House and Senate about a state subsidy again this year, so you may see that. So how does the actuary determine the contributions? Well, on slide 24, what they do is what's called an actuarial valuation. They do a full valuation every 2 years for us and do a smaller one in the even numbered years. And that calculates the funding status of the plan overall and of each of the individual groups. And they develop the rates based on that valuation. There are 3 pieces that go into the employer rate. And the slide or two from now, I'm going to go into much more detail, but it's the normal cost, the UAAL, or unfunded accrued actuarial liability, and then the medical subsidy piece for that premium offset. Each member group has a different rate based on the plan demographics of that group. And besides the actual, current salary and current headcount and things like that, the actuary has to use a number of assumptions to calculate these rates about future outcomes, both economic, the investment, inflation, things like that, but also mortality of retirees, retirement rates, what ages are people going out at. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into that, and those assumptions are sort of checked and reset as needed every 4 years in what's called an actuarial experience study. This is where they look at past experience and future projections and develop, if anything needs to change. Mortality tends to change every 4 years. Those life expectancy tables tend to go up, things like that. They will bring that to the board, and the board will debate for a couple of months, any changes to the assumptions or the investment assumption, and then act on that. So we're looking at our next experience study will be the fiscal 20 through 23 period. So about a year from now is when the actuary will be starting to crunch those numbers, and through a series of monthly board meetings, probably by May of 24, the board will be, if there are any assumptions need to be adjusted, they'll be making them by then, and then they'll start crunching the rates after that for 26, 27. So yeah, the next slide, slide 25, talks about the components of the employer rate. The first is the normal cost, and this is the estimated annual cost of pension benefits as they're earned. So this is projecting out how much needs to be set aside for, member X and member Y to have their benefit funded when they come to retire. The normal cost is also paid through the employer contribution. So the employees, members are prepaying their own benefit through their contributions, and then the employer picks up the normal cost amount over and above what the statutory member rates are. So, and the next slide will kind of show how that works for the employers. I'm going to jump to the bottom of slide 25 just to talk about the medical subsidy. As I mentioned, that's a premium offset for eligible retirees. It was closed by the legislature over a period of years in different bills in the 2000s. So it's essentially a closed pool of members who are eligible for that, most of whom are already retired. So, the projected cost of that is much more certain, and that is calculated as a pay-as-you-go rate. How much do we need in the medical subsidy accounts to pay you know, the money over the next 2 years. So there's no liability piece to that. You know, while it's a closed plan, you know, people could live another 20 to 40 to 50 years. So eventually that whole subsidy will go away, but it will continue to decline over the years. When I got here back in 10, I think we were paying about 51 million a year, and it's 41 now. So that, and the amount of the subsidy has been frozen by the legislature since 08. So it's much easier to do the math on something like that. And then the middle with all the bullets, unfunded liability. This is sort of, you know, the elephant in any conversation about any changes to NHRS that go on. And that's the estimated value of accrued NHRS benefits not yet funded. As you know, Jan showed in the illustration earlier, you know, the trust fund needs to be able to pay out these benefits. So right now we have an unfunded liability. We're about 65.6% funded, so about 2/3 of what, you know, the actuary says we need in the bank today at present value to pay benefits for retirees and people who are still working who are entitled to benefits going forward. Now, the good thing about, you know, good, but, you know, we're not going to have to pay all those benefits in one day. These are benefits paid out per month over the lifetime, you know, of tens of thousands of people. So you want to be fully funded, or you want to be close to full funding, but there is time to get there without, you know, having to do it all in a year or two. And the reason we're unfunded, and you know, often when I give presentations like this, I wonder if people, you know, said, hey, you've got a constitutional amendment. How'd you get this way? What's going on? You know, because that is important, but it's a result of a number of factors. The most largest one was artificially low employer contributions assessed to employers from 1991 through the 2010. What happened was there was a recession in New Hampshire back in 91. It was national, but it hit New Hampshire pretty hard. A lot of local banks closed. Real estate values dropped like a stone. And there was a lot of pressure on NHRS. The rates were going up in 92, 93 as a result of some benefit increases that the legislature enacted in 89. And they were going to start showing up in the rates in 92. And the rates were much, much lower back then as a percentage of pay, but as a percentage increase year over year, you know, going from 4% to 6.5% was, you know, percentage-wise a hit. So there was a lot of pressure to do something about that. The board asked our actuary at the time to recommend funding methods. The primary, the recommended method was closed 30-year amortization of your unfunded using a method called entry age normal. But their lengthy report went on to say there's 3 other ways you could do it that are acceptable under accounting standards and at the time, and one of them was much cheaper. So human beings being what they are in a pinch, the legislature passed a law saying you have to calculate the funding under what was called open group aggregate. You're not allowed to do that anymore, but that sort of stretched out the liabilities for 50 to 100 years and artificially depressed the rates. And this was pitched as a short-term solution to an economic crisis in New Hampshire, but that short-term solution stayed on the books till it was repealed in 2007. So I liken it to drilling a hole in the bottom of your boat and going back up top, and you don't realize, and your ankles are starting to get wet a few years later, what's going on. So that was a piece. There was something called gain sharing going on back in the 80s and 90s, where excess earnings, if we made more than 0.5% over our assumed rate of return at the time, that any investment income was segregated in the trust fund to pay COLAs and medical subsidy benefits. So if you're always hitting your assumed rate of return and making more than that, that's great. But if you have a year where you lose money, you don't really have that kitty from previous years because it's already promised to something else. So, and that looked great through the 90s because I think there were 8 years out of 9 we were in the mid-teens to 20%. So there was always money coming in. Seemed like a magic bullet. Consultants warned both the board and the legislature back then that this wasn't a great way to do it, but it was working, and folks let it ride essentially. And then really when the .com financial crisis, that bubble burst in 01, 02. We had 2 years of negative returns in a row, and it kind of got policymakers' attention, and there were conversations with all the affected parties, subcommittees, working groups, things like that, that ultimately led to some structural changes in beginning in 07. Went to entry age normal in the statute, put a closed 30-year amortization on the unfunded liability, made some other foundational changes that would prevent that stuff from happening again. But again, what you fixed it in 07. Guess what happened in 08 and 09? The markets, we had the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So that just exacerbated all the sins of the past. It magnified them. So, we ended up sitting with this liability, which is now $5.6 billion. Lowering the assumed rate of return over the last decade has increased that liability, but it's also brought more money in up front. So you can argue that that's strengthening the plan, but those changes have added to where we were back in 07. But we have a statutory structure to amortize most of the liability through 2039. That original liability was all of our liabilities were going to be paid off through 2039. But in 2018, the legislature passed a bill setting up what's called layered amortization. So $5 billion out of the 5.7 is going to be paid off by 2039, and future gains and losses since 17 are going to be paid off in sort of 20-year tranches, or recognized in 20-year tranches going forward. So that does two things. It takes the pressure off if there was an economic crisis, in 2037, and the liability doubled in the last year. Employers wouldn't have to pay it all at once, and it also creates a structure going forward to manage these debts over sort of the lifetime of the workers and taxpayers who are going to be benefiting from them. Right now, with the rates being what they are in the liability, we're all paying, as taxpayers for lower taxes back in the 90s for the person who used to own our house, type of thing. And there's really no way to get out of that, but that's what we're dealing with right now. So that's sort of the history.
Marty, I have another question. So is the fund set up to accept, like, if we've had a couple of years of very good revenues that were, and has, potentially left us with some extra cash to work with. Is the fund set up that in the event the state decided they wanted to make like a one-time, $50 million or whatever into reducing that unfunded liability, is it set up? Is there anything preventing us from doing it, I guess?
No.
Okay, so that is an option that could be on the table.
Yes.
All right.
So, some states in recent years have started doing that. Connecticut, I think, gave like $4 billion, which obviously that's not New Hampshire money, but it's a model that some states have started doing when they can. And Connecticut was more poorly funded than us. That was another one of those poster plans for quite some time. Next slide, slide 26. This just shows the fiscal year 24-25 rates, which take effect July 1. And it breaks it down on the far right, and the bold column is the total rate. But we talked about the normal cost piece, which is the far left column. That's what the employers are paying towards those current members' benefits, and the members are paying the rest through their own contributions. The unfunded, which is anywhere from 77 to 85% of the total of what employers are paying, and then the medical subsidy rate adds it up. So, it's a debt that's been accrued in the past. So essentially, this is a credit card payment. And if you pay your amounts required, you're going to get that debt down over time. If you pay more ahead of time, as you had just asked, it'll save you a little bit of interest in the long run and get you there faster. And then the next slide, 27, just shows a comparison year over year, 22-23 versus 24-25 rates. And you'll see that they went down across the board. That's the first time that's happened. We've seen some reductions in different groups in different rate cycles, but that's a result of the investment performance over the 5 years ending June 30th of 21. Jan talked about the 5-year actuarial smoothing. So, that 5-year period was good for us. We'll see where we're going forward. I've had some employers talk to me and say, gee, can't you just keep them the same? And you can't put them too high arbitrarily or too low, because, you know, that defeats the purpose of the plan. So we have to kind of follow the numbers, but, you know, it's good news for the employers for 24 and 25. And depending on how investments go this year and the experience study, you know, hopefully the goal is that the rates are going to be stable in the ranges they are now through 2039. Then you're going to see a big drop, because most of that liability is going to be gone by then. We don't expect them to go up a lot or go down a lot if in total the assumptions track, you know. Oh, legislation, my favorite part. So yeah, and then Jan will be taking us home in a couple more slides. But just to sort of lay of the land of recent activity over the last over the 21-22 session. Last year there were a number of bills enacted, 7 out of 13. One was actually a retained bill from 21. The year before, 11 bills introduced, only 1 enacted. This year we're looking at 20 LSRs already. I think we've probably seen all of them by now. We got one this morning even. So most of those are on the House side. So I think there's 4 that I know of, and then maybe others I got to skim for that may be going before this committee, and you'll see me again for those. You know, but since 2007, we've had more than 100 changes made to our statute. Some of those pretty significant, you know, changing member contributions, the benefit pieces, some pretty minor that affected a small cohort of people or a theoretical, you know, future person, things like that, you know, or just technical corrections, you know, to clean up some of the language. But, you know, it keeps us hopping, because many of these, especially the benefit changes, require reprogramming of computer systems. And, you know, this last year's changes require us reprogramming too, because we've got the one we're on and the one we're moving to, things like that. So you know, there's a lot of action. And that's not uncommon, even back in I look in the old bookshelf from the legislative roundups from the 70s and 80s, and there's several pages of retirement changes all along. So we are the ultimate work in progress. In slide 29, just to kind of reiterate, we're here to provide data and objective analysis so you can make informed decisions on the policy. We see changes to plan design and funding as functions of the legislature as the plan sponsor. So typically we're not going to advocate for or against any outcome, but we want to give you the numbers and the number of affected people and things like that. We do that through the fiscal note worksheets we provide to LBA. We also I put out handouts for the committee hearings called bill briefs. If there's information that the fiscal note might not capture, some history that we think may be relevant for you all, we'll put that in a bill brief and we'll testify. Typically, the only things that the board would take a position on are bills that would either directly conflict with the Internal Revenue Code and jeopardize the plan qualification status, or would in some way impede on their fiduciary duty, which is to act in the best interest of the members and beneficiaries at all times. So if something would constrain them for reasons that would prevent that, they would tend to oppose that. But we don't see a lot of the board wanting to take a stand on a lot of positions, only on the sort of existential ones. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jan to just kind of summarize what we've been covering.
Thank you very much, Marty, and thank you for hanging in there with us. So slide 30, we're almost there. As we've shown earlier, NHRS truly provides a modest pension benefit, and the great benefit of this is that most of these monies do remain in the state. We do have a plan in place to pay down our unfunded liability, and we've been making very good progress against that. And the board has taken the responsible steps that it needs to make sure that we have proper plan funding. And they do this regularly by adjusting the assumed rate of return when it's necessary, and manage the improvement in our funded ratio over time, which has done well compared to those of our peers. Page 31 shows how our funded ratio has compared to our peers. The the darker blue line is the national average of other state pension plans. And we are the lighter blue line that's below that. So even though we have been below, we are tracking upward on a higher trajectory towards positivity than the national averages, which has remained fairly flat. Page 32 is a very interesting slide. The state of Maine has done many of the same things we have. You know, we in New Hampshire started to get very serious about making some changes back in 2007 and then again in 2011. But Maine started their efforts to get fully funded about 10 years before we did. And the two state plans are actually very similar. You can see similar number of actives and retirees and similar modest annual benefit. And both states have strong constitutional protections to ensure that the plans get to be funded. So they started amortizing their unfunded liability in 1997, and we started to do ours in 2010. And they are, you can see that their funded ratio down on the bottom line is just under 84%, which is nicely ahead of ours, which is at 65.6%. So it just shows the benefit of coming up with a good plan and sticking with it. I call it eating the spinach, and it's nice to see how it's turning out so nicely for the state of Maine. Absolutely. Okay, well, the
Is it states or plans that you would consider our peers?
okay, well, the slide on page 31, that is all of the other state retirement plans. The other 49, exactly.
So there's not a category of states our size with our kind of budgets. Because when you're saying our peers, I was imagining smaller states like New Hampshire, but this is in comparison to Texas and California and.
Exactly, it's everyone. And then when I mentioned our peers for when I was talking about our investment performance, that was other pension plans throughout the country that our investment consultant Callan gathers data on. There's about 111 other pension plans that are in that peer study. That are public pension plans. Yes, these are all public.
Thank you for the clarification.
And different states have different ways of doing their pension plans. In New Hampshire, we have one plan for everyone, as does the state of Maine. But if you look to Connecticut, they have a separate plan for their teachers and then for their state employees. Different states organize it differently. So then on page 33, we are fortunate in New Hampshire to have a strong constitutional and statutory foundation to ensure that we're on a path to full funding, and that getting to full funding is going to take many years. You know, we started down this path over 10 years ago. We still have many years ahead of us, but I'm very pleased to report to you that we are making the progress we need to. So with that is the end of our formal presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Well, thank you. This has been very interesting and enlightening for me, and as I'm sure it has the others. Is there any further questions before we let them go? Go ahead, Senator Gendro.
With the housing market kind of taking another turn and slowing down, what are the thoughts from the independent investment company? Because the housing market isn't a big percentage, but it's significant. Any thoughts, any predictions on that at this point?
The Independent Investment Committee doesn't particularly look at the New Hampshire real estate market. We do have, about 10% of our portfolio invested in real estate, and it's a wide variety of different real estate funds that we are invested in. We have commercial office space, warehouse space, some multifamily, all throughout the country and throughout the world. So we have a very diversified real estate set of holdings.
Any further questions? Representative Altshuler, go ahead.
Slide 18, I have the mini version. So could you just tell, I can see that yellow says domestic equity, and my glasses can't make out, like, what is gray?
The gray, that is the foreign stocks.
Okay. Non-US.
Yeah, non-US equity.
And green?
Is fixed income, which is bonds. And the brownish one is real estate. And the red one is alternative investments, and that means private equity and private debt.
And in real estate, is it direct investment in properties, or is it like in REITs and other real estate-based trusts?
We are invested mainly in different funds that, different limited partnerships is how we do it, the vast majority of it.
Sorry about the size on that. I'll send over a full-size PDF of this
Okay.
for the record, for the committee if you need. And also, I neglected to mention earlier in the folder, there's also several handouts on the right-hand side that, we do them as sort of issue briefs, NHRS Now You Know, and there is one that goes into a little bit more background on the main piece. It includes that chart, and there's a couple others that are maybe timely in terms of legislation you'll be seeing. There's one about COLAs, and the age 65 benefit adjustment in Group 1, which is another Senate bill that's coming your way. So, but if you have any questions for us now or ever, just give us a call and we'll be glad to meet or come over or talk on the phone or get you some data.
Thank you. We appreciate you as a resource. I'm certain we'll have some as we go. Any further? Yeah.
So on number 16, slide 16. So last year when you did include the COLA adjustment, and you had mentioned that we know that New Hampshire does not have a statutory COLA adjustment in place that we reinvent the wheel every time we do it. Our peers, what is the percentage of states that have even a 2 or 3 year and then a review of that COLA? Where do we fall in that lineup?
I would say on a national side, we have a very small COLA benefit compared to many other plans. Many other plans have regular annual COLAs, but this is something that varies greatly. And in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 great financial crisis, many states scaled back their COLAs. And the reason why is that COLAs are very expensive. It goes back to that compounding comment, being the eighth wonder of the world. Well, compounding COLAs are incredibly expensive. Even if they're just 1 or 2%, you compound that over a 20, 30, or 40-year retirement, and you end up with a very significant part of that retirement benefit now being the COLA over time.
There is a group called NASRA, which is a National Association of Retirement System Administrators, that these are, again, statewide plans across the U.S. And they do put out some research on COLAs. I can, if you're interested, I can send over the most recent chart that shows state by state what people are doing, because it is sort of a patchwork. But to Jen's point, states that do have permanent COLAs, almost all of them reduced them in the great financial crisis, and a lot of them are now tied to CPI plus or minus 0.5% with a cap of X. They're not unlimited anymore, but it was tightened up. But New Hampshire never had a permanent COLA. They had been funded through the general fund for many years, and that's why the idea of the special account and that gain sharing and putting investment income aside seemed like a good idea, back in the 80s, because it created a theoretical funding source for it, but it didn't in the long run.
Any further questions? Or-
One other question, where, since we have you both here, so in addition to, the COLA that we did, we also put in that one-time, valve relief for the municipalities of the 7.5%. What kind of, have we evaluated what kind of ease or pressure that took off of the municipalities? So that we can project out how, if we were to do that again, or what the benefit would be to having, us reassume our original responsibility, even incrementally.
I think just anecdotally, we didn't do any outreach, and actually NHMA, I'm sure they'll be speaking about the bill when it comes. They may have some more survey data or actual examples of how municipalities were impacted by the reimbursements this year. I think, any town or school is happy to get money back. But yes, as to how that translated into property tax release or, improving services, we don't have any of that data.
Yeah, no, I was looking at how it, my thought process is how it is, reflected in the management side of the funds. When you know that there's going to be this payout.
On a practical basis, it had no impact on NHRS because we received the contributions that we would normally receive, and then the board has certified what each employer's refund amount will be, and that is being paid by the state treasurer with state funds. So it's had no effect on our operations, other than having to calculate those numbers for them to be certified.
They're essentially pass-through dollars? Yeah, okay. All right, I've got to wrap this up because I have a 10:30 meeting. So we appreciate all that you've done and the presentation, and I know I've learned a lot. And thank you all to the committee members. We got through our first day. So with that, I will close the session for today. Thank you.